My name is Déanda Johnson. I'm interviewing Mrs. Luella Henry at her home in Bidwell, Ohio on August the 21st, 2008. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this interview with us. I'm going to start with some easy questions and then they'll get a little bit more difficult as we go on. What is your full name and please spell it for us?
Luella Henry, Luella-Henry.
And what's your maiden name?
Evans.
Remember to say my maiden name is.
My maiden name is Evans.
Okay. What is your date and place of birth?
September the 23rd, 1929, Bidwell, Ohio.
And were you born at home or in a hospital?
At home. I was born at home.
Okay. And do you remember, was a midwife in attendance, was a doctor?
A midwife was in attendance. Her name was Miss Duskin.
And who was Miss Duskin?
She was a midwife that they would call in those days. She lived in the community of Bidwell.
And can you tell us a little bit about the community of Bidwell when you were growing up?
Yes, the Bidwell community when I was growing up was much different than it is today. During those days, there was a barbershop, grocery store, 2 restaurants, a filling station, and all these things we don't have today. We even had a movie once a week.
Was Bidwell a segregated or integrated community?
Bidwell was an integrated community, but there was more blacks here than it was whites at that time.
Can you tell us a little bit about your family's ethnic or racial background? Like, what race is your family?
All right, my mother was black and my father was black. I have a grandmother that was white, and I had some Indian, I don't know what tribe on my mother's side, but on my father's side, my grandmother was a white woman.
And what race do you identify with?
Black. I'm from the black race.
Can you tell me who were your parents? Where were they born? A little bit about what you know about your parents.
All right, my father, we'll start with him. He was born in Meigs County. That's a very small place. I think it's about 20 miles from here. And my mother was born in a little, very small town called Campaign. That's right. Wrong. Can I correct that?
Yeah.
She was born in Logan, Ohio. But her mother died when she was very young, when she was an infant. And then her grandparents raised her in a little small place called Campaign, which is about 3 miles from here.
And what was your mother's name?
Mildred Clark Evans.
Can you tell me what you know about your grandparents, first starting with your father's side?
Okay, I really didn't know my grandparents on my father's side. These were just things that I heard about him, about his side when growing up, but I didn't know them. My mother's family, I knew my great-grandmother. Her name was Mittie Pounds. I knew my grandfather, Lou Clark, my great-grandfather, John Sandy Clark.
And this is on your mother's side?
That's on my mother's side.
Do you know how they got to Ohio? What brought your family to Ohio?
Well, I think my mother's family was, they were probably slaves with her great-grandparents, and so they migrated here from someplace in Virginia. I'm not sure of the place in Virginia, but I do know that it was in Virginia when, I heard that as I was growing up. My father, as I said, he was born in Meigs County, lived there, but then he built a house here in Bidwell. He worked at the brickyard in Nelsonville, Ohio. And then he came here, like I said, and built a house and raised a family here.
What brought him to Bidwell?
I'm not sure, but I think maybe because property was very cheap and he acquired this land and built a house on it, I think, because Bidwell was probably cheaper than in the Nelsonville, Logan area.
So he continued to work in the Nelsonville area and commute back?
Yes. for a long time until he got older in age, and then he retired and came home.
Do you know your parents' date of birth? What was your mother's date of birth?
February the 14th, 1901. Let me see, 1901 I think it was. And my father was August the 25th, 1898. Or I think that's about right.
And what were their dates when they passed away? What were... Oh.
Did I say my father? I made a mistake there. My father was August the 20th, 1878 when he was born.
Oh, 1878?
Uh-huh. He was a lot older than my mother. And he died June the 20th, 1969. My mother was born February 14th, 1903 in Logan, Ohio. And she died August the 22nd, 1988.
Now, can you tell me about your brothers and sisters? How many brothers and sisters did you have, and where do you fit in the lineup?
Well, I had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. I'm next to the oldest. I have 1 sister living now, and just she and I, that's all that's left.
And what's her name?
Veda Mayo.
What was the name of your spouse?
William Henry.
Don't forget to answer in complete sentences. Can you tell me a little bit about William Henry? How did you meet him? Where was he born?
He was born in Brookneal. My husband was born in Brookneal, Virginia. His family moved to Harper Heights, West Virginia, at a very young age, and then he went to Columbus to work, and then he went in the Army from Columbus, and then when he came out of the Army, well, I was on vacation in Columbus, and I met him there. We were married in 1946. To that union was born 7 children, I'm sorry. 7 children. I have, now there's 5 living, 2 dead.
Can you describe your wedding a little bit? Like, how did you guys, like, what was your relationship like before you got married? Like, did you date for a long time? And then how did you guys decide to get married?
No, we didn't date that long, about 3 or 4 months. And we were married in a place called Worthington, Ohio. Very short courtship.
Was it a big wedding? Can you describe?
No, we were married for just a piece.
What made you decide to go to Worthington, Ohio?
Well, that's so near Columbus, Ohio. And at that time, I was back in Columbus, and he lived there. So we got married in Worthington. Worthington's only about 3 miles on the outside of Columbus.
Was your family in attendance at the wedding? Who attended the wedding, or when you guys got married, who was there?
Just he and I. We got married just a piece.
Can you talk a little bit about your schooling growing up? Where did you go to school, and what was it like going to school? Was it an integrated school or a segregated school?
The first 6 years of school, I attended Bidwell, which was a black school. It was just a black school. Then in the 7th grade, I went to Bidwell Porter, and I graduated from Bidwell Porter, and that was integrated at that time.
Did you notice any difference between when you attended a colored school or a black school versus the integrated school? What were the differences?
Well, I can't really say that there was a lot of difference. Of course, I feel that I got a better education the first 6 years than I did the last, although it was higher grades. However, the black teachers were very dedicated, because some of them were just starting out teaching. And they wanted each student to do the best they can. It was a very small class. Well, when I graduated, it was only a class of 35. So you can see that all through school it was just, very small.
And what year did you graduate from high school?
In 1946, same year I was married.
And how many people were in your graduating class of high school?
35.
Oh, that was the,
Mhm.
oh, okay. And what were the job opportunities like when you graduated from high school?
They weren't that good. You almost had to, unless you were going to do day work, they called it at that time, in people's homes. The salary was very low. You had to leave here to go away to get a job. And I went to Columbus from here. And the only job that I had then was just working in a restaurant. But my husband worked at Bidwell Memorial Institute in Columbus, so he, did real well. Then he worked in a foundry there. In fact, he retired from Westinghouse in Columbus, Ohio.
Once you got married, did you continue to work in the restaurant or did you stay home?
I stayed home.
And what restaurant did you work in Columbus?
At Mills Restaurant. And then there was a little place called Chesapeake on Mount Vernon. I worked there for about 5 months.
And what made you go to Columbus versus another city when you decided after graduating from high school?
Well, my relatives there, I had an uncle there, and I stayed with him when I first went up there. So that's the reason why, because there was really nothing here.
And what industry was in Bidwell? What made people move to this area? Do you know what brought people to Bidwell?
No, I really don't. It was just a little community, and I don't know. I can't answer that because I'm not sure why they came, why they settled in Bidwell.
What were some of the family names of families that lived in Bidwell when you were younger?
There was the Paynes, there was the Lees, Bordens, Clarks, Hickmans, Mayos, and Diggs.
And these were all?
These were all black people I'm talking about.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say the population of Bidwell was like when you were growing up?
There was about 400 to 500 people, I'd say, at this time. Bidwell was just, it was quite a few people. Now it's down very low. I don't even know what it is right now.
What made you move back to Bidwell?
Well, I liked Bidwell, and this is why I wanted to raise my family, because at that time, the cities were getting real corrupt, and I wanted them to be here to have a better chance of school and all that. I felt it was just better to come back here.
So what year did you move back to Bidwell?
Let's see, we came back here to stay in 53, I think it was. 55 maybe, 53, 55, something like that.
And how did your husband make a living once you guys moved back to Bidwell?
Well, he didn't come back right then. He was working in coal mines. Because we had moved quite a bit. We left Columbus and went to Pennsylvania. My oldest daughter was born in Pennsylvania in steel mill. And his family worked in the coal mines in a little place called, it's right out of Beckley, West Virginia, in Lillybrook. So he stayed there, but they were always going on strike, etc. So we both come back and started working at Lakin State Hospital. And then I left Lakin and came to Galplis. And I worked at Galplis State Institute. It was then. Now it's called Galplis Developmental Center. And I worked there 28 years. And he was working in Columbus at Westinghouse, and he stayed there until he retired from there. And then he came home. Now,
can you describe what kind of work did you do at the Lincoln State Hospital and at the Galpolis?
I worked in dietary at Lakin, but when I came to Galplis Development, I worked on what we called the wards then as an aide. And then I went in supervision. I worked there 9 years, then I went in supervision. And I stayed in supervision from then until I retired.
Can you talk a little bit about the racial climate when you were growing up here in southeastern Ohio? What was it like for African Americans who were here in this part of Ohio?
Well, I understand. Right here in this immediate area, it wasn't too bad. Although just a mile away, in a place called Porter, there was a Ku Klux Klan, and that was pretty bad because they would burn crosses in people's yards. But I was very small then, so most of this is just what I heard my family talk about. And there was an incident where a white man married a black lady, and they burnt a cross in the yard and then was trying to break into the house. Of course, this white man was shot, and they had quite a big trial around here about it. But they had to get lawyers from Columbus to come in to the town to give him fair trial.
So, okay, the husband of the woman was shot someone?
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember their name?
Oh, no, it's a brother. It was a brother of hers, I think, that shot this white man called. The Smith ladies' brother, I'm not sure what their maiden name was, Scott, I think. Yes, it was Scott. Shot this man called Luke Sexton. And of course, this was a trial that went on for many weeks, at least 2 weeks. And this.
What was the outcome?
Well, this man was free because he was trying to break in the house. He was protecting his home because he stayed there with his sister.
Do you remember any other incidents here?
Well, I had just heard about the Ku Klux Klan, you know, burning crosses at different places. But all in all, it wasn't, you know, I didn't have anything I could really say because I started to a mixed school in the 7th grade, and I didn't have any problems there.
Were all the restaurants and the facilities pretty integrated here?
No, they were black restaurants here in Bidwell.
Oh, okay.
And in Galplis, they were segregated. You really couldn't, you know, go in there and just feel free to just go in and sit down and eat. You could take out, but you could. But here in Bidwell, they had the black restaurants.
Can you talk a little bit about kind of the black-owned businesses here in Bidwell when you were growing up? Do you remember?
The restaurants were in Bidwell. The restaurants were the only ones that was owned by black people, and they were pretty prosperous because they got, you know, people went there and came from other places out there as I was growing up. The grocery store was owned by white. The filling station was owned by white. Barbershop was white. So.
What were the names of those restaurants that were owned by Africans?
There was a Hard restaurant and a Ford restaurant. The white restaurant was just there for a little while. That was more or less, the white I'm talking about, the name of it was white. It was a place where you could go and, you know, the teenagers could go down there and just, you know, sort of, but that lasted about 2 years.
What were some of the other things you mentioned? The teenagers went to the restaurant. What are some of the other things that teenagers and young people were able to do for fun when you were growing up?
Well, we had a movie in Galplis we could go to, but we had to sit in a balcony. At that time, we couldn't, you know, they had one downstairs and one balcony, and a black had to sit in a balcony. I remember that real well. The other things, we sort of create our own. You know, like we would have wiener roasts and, you know, little house parties and things. There wasn't a lot of money during that time either. So you just sort of create your own fun. And then we'd walk down railroad track, really that well, Sunday afternoon, and, you know, things of that sort. So we played ball, and when we'd have a wiener roast, we'd have apple bobbing. And just actually just create our own fun.
You mentioned a movie would come to Bidwell too?
Yes. That was up at one of the places up on the corner, right across where the depot used to be, because the train used to run through here, and we had, you know, a train would come through and stop. And right across from there was a building, and they would show movies on Saturday night. And at that time, I think you had to pay maybe a quarter to get in.
What kind of movies?
Some of Westerns, and mostly Westerns.
Can you talk a little bit about how did you begin to learn about your family's history?
Just by listening to my parents. And of course, my sister, now she was a great one on genealogy. And she searched a lot and found out a lot about what was going on.
And what are some of the things that you have found out about your family?
Well, where they migrated from, like coming from Virginia. Then my mother used to tell about her family that was in slavery, some of her great-grandmother, I think it was. And you know how they would take food out to the children. Sometimes they'd have to hide the food in their clothing to take, and then she would, the story that I always got amused with was the story about the paw parrot. And I don't know if this is true or a fable, but anyway, this lady had took a lot of white bread that they had made rolls and things, I assume, and she put under her clothes. And this this paw parrot said, "Polly gonna tell, Polly gonna tell." And she pulled her dress up to show us. Polly said, "I see, I see." So the paw parrot, so the story goes, supposedly when he saw this, he died. But, you know, I'm not sure. That's a fable, I think. I'm not sure all that happened, but that was the story that they told, you know, about it. And my father's family was free, so he didn't know, you know, too much about that. Only he knew about how they would come through Galplis, and they had the places for the underground to get the slaves across, because once they come across the bridge of Point Pleasant into Ohio, well, then they were considered free. But they had a lot of help getting here. So.
Now, what role, if any, did Bidwell play in the Underground Railroad?
Well, there's a house that's tore down now, which it's not actually Bidwell, but it was about a mile away in Porter, that they housed the slaves. But, you know, it's no longer there.
Do you know anything about the owners of the house? What do you know about the house?
Very little. Very little. In Galplis, no, there's a couple places. I don't even know the names of the people that owned it, but one is still there. They sort of made a museum out of it. And there was a church in Galplis, I think it was a Black Methodist church that, you know, was aided in helping the people when they come here to get further up north.
Now, you mentioned a little bit about what you learned from your parents about slavery. Was it common for people to talk about slavery, or what did you learn about slavery growing up, and how did you learn about it?
Everything I heard about slavery was very bad. The masters would have the children. I mean, I guess that's how some of the names come into play, was from the people that owned the slaves. And, you know, and all this came from my mother and my grandfather. And he was talking about his father, you know, as to what had happened there. And they would actually whip them with belts and things. Well, they didn't call them belts, but it was some kind of rawhide, I think they used. And if some of them tried to escape, well, then they would find them, they'd have dogs after them. It was just very cruel as to the things that they said that happened there. And if slave master wanted to come into your house and take, you know, one of the women, he did. They couldn't do anything about it. So the only joy they could find was they had songs as they sang, these old spirituals and, you know, things like that. And they couldn't take that away from them, and they knew how to pray. So they said that this is what, you know, they did, because I said, well, how could you stand, you know, to even to hear of that or even know about that? Because my great-grandfather, he said, he worked in cotton fields. And if they didn't get a certain amount of cotton picked, then they would beat them for that. So they knew that it was terrible, and that was in Virginia. But I'm not sure what part of Virginia it was, but I guess the whole state was about like that.
Now, you mentioned that your grandmother on your father's side was white. How did your grandparents meet? Do you know anything about that?
No, I don't. I think maybe they both were from Meigs County, and I don't know how well that was accepted during that time, but evidently they seemed to, you know, have done okay, because it was four boys, I think, was born, and one sister was born to that union.
You mentioned Bidwell as being a predominantly African-American community. What are some of the other communities around here that were predominantly African-American?
A place called Black Fork, Ohio. That was predominantly black at one time. Harrisburg. And no, Galplis wouldn't have been. Galplis probably half and half, I'd say. Morgan, Ohio, Buck Ridge. These are little communities that near here. I think Morgan's about 6 miles from here. Buck Ridge probably the same way, but one going south, one going east. And they were all black people. Then they wasn't any work at that time for them, so they had to leave. So things have certainly changed from what it was then to what it is now, because now, you know, there's plants that they can work in. Galbraith Developmental Center, where I retired from, I think it is more blacks there than any place. So they can stay here now because they can make a living here.
You mentioned Black Fork. What do you know about Black Fork?
Well, now it's very small. I mean, it's not as many people there, I don't think, as it is here. But during that time, we all used to like to go to Black Fork because the guys were over there. You know, you'd go over to see them, and there was a church over there that have what they call union meetings, which is really basket dinners, but they called them union meeting because each Sunday with the Baptist Association, there was different churches in the summer. You know, that one would have union meeting this Sunday and the next, and Black Fork was always included. I think Black Fork was about the last one in July. And we always went to the union meetings over there.
Do you know anything about the community that neighbored, what do you know about the community that neighbored Black Fork called Poke Patch?
That was in Black Fork, I think. I'm pretty sure it was. It was just a little place up on the hill, and this is where they lived, like another street or something. It was just a little, maybe several houses up there, and that was all.
What, if any, connection does your family have? Do any of your ancestors or relatives come out of the Black Fork area, Black Fork, Poke Patch area?
No.
Oh, okay. They all started here
Mm-hmm.
in
Or
Gallup.
Gallup County and Meigs County and surrounding areas.
You started to talk a little bit about church. Can you kind of talk about the role that church played in your life growing up, and what denomination do you come out of?
I came out of Baptist denomination. I started out there because I was baptized there in a little church called Mount Carmel, which coming by you would have passed. It's a new church now, but did you notice a little white church beside it? That's where I went to Sunday school, and that's where I went growing up. Reverend Payne was the pastor there. He was a pastor for many, many years. I'd say at least 50 years before they changed. And of course, it's quite different now because Reverend Gene Armstrong is the pastor out there now. And it's different, much different than what it used to be. Of course, I used to go right across the street now to the Apostolic Church.
Oh, what kind of church is it?
Apostolic.
Oh, okay. Is it predominantly African American?
Yes, well, it's mixed.
What would you say the role of the church was when you were growing up?
The role of the church was your guidance, really your mark that you grew up under that church. The older people in the church, well, they would correct you. I had one teacher I'm very fond of. She's dead now, Miss Borden, Bernice Borden. Her father was a pastor there, and she was very good. She was a school teacher. And everybody looked to Miss Bernice for guidance. She wanted you to be somebody. She did everything she could to let you know to hold your head high and to be somebody. But her famous thing was, don't tell a lie, because if you tell a lie, you'll steal. And that was something that was instilled, I think, with a lot of us. I mean, I even instilled that in my children, you know, because I'm not saying they didn't lie, but that was something that was sort of something that you went by.
How, growing up, what were the kind of the mechanisms that parents used, like for punishments and different things like that when you were growing up? If you did something wrong, how were you punished?
Well, there's something called switches, you know, that they used that switch quite often. It wasn't a thing like now that you ground people. It was, if somebody come and told something wrong, you were just going to get that switch, whether it was true or not. That was the one thing because you didn't really get a chance to defend yourself. If an older person said it, that was it. You know you better behave yourself because that switch was waiting for you.
Do you remember a time when you got in trouble that you don't mind talking about or sharing?
Well, there was a couple times. Once growing up, I was about 5 or 6 years old, and we had a fireplace. And I can remember the soap suds on my face, and I liked to play in the soap suds. But well, my father was determined that I wasn't going to, you know, because it's going to break my face out. And I run from him, and my gown caught on fire. So he used an old coat or something to smother, you know, the flames with. So as a result, I used to have to wear long underwear to school. But even growing up until I got to the 7th, 8th grade, going to the other school, well, you wear these underwear, you had to wear the old long underwear under your stockings, cotton stockings, because he thought this would keep you from getting cold and protect you. And when I was going up there, well, I did not want to wear those. So right at Mount Carmel, we could walk to school from where I lived. It was about a half a mile. I stopped at the church in this outside toilet and took off these stockings and, you know, pinned the underwear up so that you wouldn't see them. Of course, I got sick because when I come back, I had to stop back. There had snow all over me. It was cold, so that they wouldn't know it. And well, I got pneumonia that night. And as a result of that, I didn't have to wear underwear anymore. These old stuff. I wear knee socks, you know. So that was something, because he was from the old school, that you wear all that. Another time that I remember that I really got in trouble, because I didn't get in trouble with that because I got sick. But they would give you castor oil with it every Saturday, and that was the worst mess you ever seen. It made me sick, and I spit on my father. That's the only time I can ever remember of him spanking me, because he did spank me for spitting his face. But it made me sick. I didn't have to take castor oil anymore anyway, but I had to pay the price for it. Another time, I don't know why I spit on people, but another time I spit on my cousin. And I really did it. My mother, she used a switch. Didn't get too many. And we had to go out to pick blackberries, and I hated that. So I would go out and just take the berries and rub them in my hand to get the sting. But I'd always, somehow, the bucket would fall over. But I hadn't picked the berries because I didn't want to. So, of course, that time I stopped doing that. Then she started making me do the housework, you know, mop the floors, things of that sort. And this is about the only thing I can remember of ever really getting in trouble about.
You mentioned home remedies like castor oil. Why did they make you take castor oil? What did they believe it did for
Oh,
you?
it was supposed to just clean your body out. It would prevent you from having colds, you know, and all this crazy stuff. And cod liver oil was another thing, and that was the nastiest stuff you ever taste. I said, I'd never do that to my children. That was terrible.
What are some other home remedies that people use?
Oh, well, they had something called yellow root. If you got a sore throat, you gargled in yellow root, which is terrible. The only thing that tasted pretty good was they made cough syrup in the winter. And if I can't remember all the ingredients they put in this, but my father, he didn't believe in alcohol, but he always bought this pint of some kind of whiskey. I can't remember the name of it. And he put rock candy in it and glycerin and something else, but I don't know to this day what it was. So as soon as you got a cold, you got a tablespoon of this cough syrup, which did taste bad. But that was, oh, they had what they call mullen policies when you got a cold they put on you. And some people use this aesthetic. We didn't, but I had a girlfriend that they would pin this on her, and she was in high school. And they would pin it on her chest, and it was, if you ever smelled asbestos, it's the worst stuff you could ever smell. But we didn't have to do that.
You mentioned what kind of poultice?
They called it policies. It was, they'd take mullein leaves and boil them and then put them in a white pillow slip or something white, and they would pin it on you at night. And also they used Vicks Air, but they said you couldn't use that in the daytime, so you had that at night if you got a cold or something. So that's really, you know, what they used their own home remedies during that time. And slipperella, I forgot that. That was another. My father would go out and get all this stuff in the fall, and they used it all year because that's, you know, what they gave you.
And where would these things grow, like the yellow root and the other things?
Out in the woods, but they seemed to know what it was. And if you'll notice on some of the medication you get today, you'll look on it and you see those are some of the same ingredients that they used, you know, back then.
In the poultice, what kind of bag was it put in?
They put it in a towel or a pillow slip and laid it on your chest. And the pillow slip, they would fold it over. And the towel, just they put pins in it and they pin it to you, and that's supposed to help you. And it did, really.
What kind of medical care was available for you growing up?
Well, we had this doctor in Galplis that I can remember, Dr. Brown and Dr. Gilbert, that came. They would come to your house at that time. You didn't have, the hospital. Hoser Hospital was developed at a very early age. I can't remember exactly when, but before that, they just had doctors that come to the house.
And how often would you see a doctor growing up, or under what circumstances would people see
You'd
doctors?
have to be really sick to see a doctor, maybe have pneumonia even, something like that, because you didn't have the regular checkups like you do today. The same way with dentists. It wasn't anything with dentists. If you got toothache, they'd put some kind of something in your mouth that would numb it, and you just didn't have the medical care that you would have today.
When was the first time that you saw a doctor?
Probably when I got burned. Yes, then I think it's the first time. Now, I was very young then. 5 or 6 years old when the doctor came to the house.
And so, explain how you got burnt again.
Well, I was trying to dry the soap. Somebody said, "Oh, have you ever seen an open fireplace?" And I got down by it. It's a wonder it hadn't burnt my hair and everything, but it didn't. The scars I have on my arm now is faded. You can hardly see it. Then I have some on my back, but it didn't do anything. Then I had a little place on the cheeks. But it had it been from my father not being so quick to act, I could have got burnt really bad. But I can remember of him getting this old coat, and I was trying to run out the door, and he caught me at the door. Now, that's all I can really remember of that, but somehow, I don't know, that stays in my mind of this old coat throwing and him sort of, smothering the flames, because my gown was on fire.
What are some of the ailments that people suffer from in your family, or diseases that are common in your family?
High blood pressure has been the thing that my mother had a stroke as a result of high blood pressure. And she had cancer, but she survived that when she was 65. She had cancer of the wound, I think it was. But she survived that and got okay. But then she had high blood pressure and she had a stroke. And my father lived until he would have been 90 years old when he died. Like he died in June, and in August he would have been 90. My mother was 86, I think it was.
What do you think accounts? Most of the people in your family seem to live for a long time. What do you think it seems to account for their longevity?
Well, I think it was clean living. I would say, and to this day, that I think it's a very clean living because, neither one of them drank, smoked, or anything. So I think that had a lot to do with it. And they raised a lot of vegetables, ate, well, and they raised their own meats.
How about your husband? How old was he when he passed away?
60. He would have been, he was born 22, and he died in 88. So he was about 66.
Oh, so the same year your mother died?
Mm-hmm.
And may I ask, how did he pass?
Well, he had emphysema and a lot of, different things were working in the mines. And that was just about it when he died. I think he died of lung problems.
Now, a lot of the men around here seem to work in coal mines. Do a lot of them suffer from working in the coal mines?
The majority of them did, because not too very many men left in Bidwell, black men. They've all died from emphysema and miners' disease.
You mentioned that your parents had their own garden and produced their own meat. Can you talk a little bit about what kinds of foods did you eat growing up?
Well, we had chickens that we had eggs from, and then, they raised pigs. You had a lot of pork. Then my mother would can a lot of the vegetables that they grow, green beans and corn, because they didn't have freezers then. So she actually canned it and, you know, made apple butter and things of that sort.
How about outdoor plumbing and electricity? How old were you when you got indoor plumbing?
Goodness. I was in high school when we had indoor plumbing, because we had outside toilets and, you know, had kerosene lamps. Of course, the electric came before the others did, and the running water and things, because you didn't have any of that. We had a pump that you had to get water from, heat water, coal stoves.
How'd you guys get clothing and different things?
Well, a lot of it, people knew how to, you know, sew and to make their own clothes, and they'd get material, you know, real cheap. And I can remember even back when they would go to a place called the mill and have feed sacks to make your dresses or skirts or whatever from. But I was one of the lucky ones too, because I had an aunt that lived in Columbus, my father's sister, and she would send boxes of things down to us. So we were poor, you know, but actually we weren't, you know, that bad, because we always had plenty. I can never remember us not having enough food. We always had plenty of food. And maybe we didn't have everything that we needed, but we had the things, you know, that we could get along. Because I could say proudly that we weren't hungry, and we always had maybe not the best kind of clothes, but my mother always, she didn't have a washing machine at first, and she had to wash on the washboard. And I'm sure that was very difficult for her. I didn't realize how bad it was until after, you know, I got into high school and I was older, that how many sacrifices she made trying to, you know, take care of us. But my father, you know, provided the best he could, because during that time you didn't make any money. But the money then, if you made $1, is equal to $10 now, you know what it was.
Do you remember what age you started to have to work at? What age did you have to start working at?
Oh, I was out of school when I started working last year of school, because I didn't work too long. But I worked more after, you know, I was married than I did when I was growing up.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you remember about the Depression?
I only heard about it. I really don't remember, because I think I was in 29, and that was the same year I was born, so I can't really, you know, I've heard them talk about how bad it was, but I can't remember anything much about it.
How about World War II?
Yes, I remember World War II very well, because, see, my husband was in World War II, and I can remember I was just a teenager then when that happened. I think I must have been about 15 or 16 when it ended. But I remember that real well, and it was always good to see the soldiers come home, because the uniforms just were so impressive that, you know, see, this man has been in service, he's coming home in uniform, and you like that.
How many men from Bidwell fought in World War II? Do you remember how many?
No, I don't know.
What else do you remember about World War II? How did it affect
Well,
you?
there was rations and things on gasoline, ration on coffee. You had stamps that you had to buy, gasoline, even food. Coffee was something you really had to buy, sugar, flour, all that. And I remember of these stamps that you had to use, going even to the grocery store, to anywhere just about, you had to have these stamps. And because it was rationed, you know, with that. And I remember when the bomb Pearl Harbor, you know, and all that. I was very young, but I can remember of all, you know, of that happening, and how it was such a tragic thing to think, well, they had bombed Pearl Harbor. I guess it's just about all I remember about it. You saw, work was plentiful then, but it was great sacrifice for war, you know, going on to make work plentiful. So that was anything that we were ever proud about.
Do you need a water break?
Maybe just a little
Okay.
bit.
How much water?
Just a sip or two.
I just have a few more questions, not that many more left.
It's okay.
Can you tell us a little bit about what kind of music did you listen to growing up?
Oh, we like jazz. I mean, that was just a great thing. The blues and all that. That was back in the 60s. And that was just real in the 40s, 50s. And Nat King Cole, Brooke Benton, uh, Otis Redding, all that group. That was fun.
How about radio? What do you remember about the radio growing up?
Okay, with radio, you heard Amos and Andy, and Johnny Dollar, and just things, like that. That's all you heard, because you didn't have television those days. Television became much later. So you only had the radio, and the Grand Ole Opera was something you just listened to on Saturday nights. It was a treat. And everybody didn't have a radio. They had these battery radios. And we were forced to have a battery radio, and people would come to your house and make ice cream on Saturday nights. They had ice cream. My mother would make what we call plain cakes without ice. Pound cakes, what they are, but we'd call them plain cakes back then. And people would come, whoever had the radio. As long as the batteries would last, you'd come until somebody else got some more batteries, go to their house maybe. But.
Now, you mentioned Amos and Andy. Now, how did African American people feel about that radio show? Were they excited about it? What were?
Well, it was only entertainment that you had was to listen to, but you didn't have too many programs to choose from. So Amos and Andy was just something delightful. But I'm sure in later years he wasn't that delightful. But right then, because you just listened to what you had, and you would hear music, string music, and things like that on the radio.
How often would you listen to the radio?
Every weekend, every Friday and Saturday night, because during the week you had to get your lessons, for school, and you had to go to bed early. So the radio and everything, we didn't listen to it. Now the adults did, I'm sure, but we didn't, because you had to just study. My mother and father, my father especially was very great on education, and you do everything that you could do, and you make the best of yourself. Which he instilled, that was a good thing, because that was something I could pass on to my children, and they've all done, well.
How old were you when you got a television?
Actually, we didn't get a television until I was married. We didn't have a television. I mean, my mother and them got one later years because of, the children getting poor, but we didn't have television growing up. I was 19 years old, but I was married then. We had our first television.
And what kind of shows did you watch when you guys got your television?
Anything that was available. You didn't have but 3 channels to choose from. At that time, it was 3, 8, 13. And wasn't 3, 8, and 13 certainly wasn't like it is today, because it was very limited as to what you could see. You would see maybe some game shows, and that was just great. You see it right on there. Then you see some dancing and, things of that sort.
Can you talk a little bit about what effect do you think the civil rights movement had on this area, if any, and how did you hear about the civil rights movement?
Well, I had heard about it before I went to work even at GDC. But it really was an opportunist thing, for us, because now my sister was the first black lady to go to GDC, Galbraith Developmental Center. And she went there as an aide because that's, what we had then. Then I think maybe I was the 4th one, to go there. And it was all because of the civil rights movement and having equal rights. When I went in supervision, I was the first person to go in supervision, first person of color, to go in supervision. That is contributed to the civil rights movement also, because then it became equal rights. You had to be hard if you were qualified for the position.
Do you remember anything else about the civil rights movement? How did black people react to the civil rights movement here in southeastern Ohio? What was the conversations that people had around it?
Very happy about it, that they would have equal rights, and they would have an opportunity to better themselves, to get a position that if they were qualified for it. Because sometimes I know you had to fight for some of the things you wanted, like bringing in people from other places here, because this was something completely new to it.
You mentioned segregation at the movie theaters. Were there segregation in other places like roller skating or swimming and different things like that? Where were some of the things that were segregated?
Well, to my knowledge, we didn't get to go to the skating rink until much later. I mean, so it was strictly segregated, yes. The city pool, well, that was unthought of, you know, for a black person going, they would contaminate it. We weren't even considered, you know, to even participate in that. But now we, you know, I mean, it's been like that for several years, they can.
Do you remember when African Americans were allowed to gain entrance into these facilities?
Yes. You know, they had no choice because you go bring a suit against them if they didn't. So, of course, they, you know, went into it. I can remember of going to Virginia Beach, even my first time going to Virginia Beach. And it was just fantastic to know that we could go to Virginia Beach too, because it's something that you couldn't do in the past.
When did you go to Virginia Beach?
I didn't go to Virginia Beach until I retired from GDC. That was in the 90s. That's the first time I ever been to the beach. I went to Virginia Beach, and then it was such a pleasure just to be able to go that. So then one year I went to Virginia Beach, the next year I went to Myrtle Beach, and I just thought, this is all fantastic. Just think we could do all this. But I'll tell you something I remember the first time going to Richmond, Virginia, right after they integrated, and I was on the bus. And we couldn't, you know, you had to sit in the back of the bus. And I couldn't understand why. I really couldn't. And I was married then, and, you know, and had children. But when I got to Richmond, Virginia, it was integrated. But it was something to think that you ride all this time and you can't even go. They had a place marked colored. That was, I can't remember the place that was. I think it was Red House, I think, where they had colored white. You couldn't go in the white. You had to go in this little dinky place. It was terrible. And I remember sitting on the bus saying I was not going in because I'd hear the other people coming. They'd go on in there and be eating fried chicken they'd carried on the bus because you couldn't go in those places, so they carried their food with them. But then they'd come back and said, oh, it was terrible in there. But they went. And I stayed on there until we got almost to Richmond. And everything they said about it was true, because it was awful.
Now, what made you go to Richmond? Why were you going to Richmond, Virginia?
Well, we were living in Beckley then. Well, a place, not really Beckley, because we lived in Harper Heights. But the mines had shut down, and there just wasn't any work. And there was work down there. And I was going down there, you know, to work. And they had, you know, because Washington, D.C. was close to Richmond. And there was babysitting jobs and things like that where you could stay on the place. I was only there about 6 months, and I came back because my youngest daughter broke her leg, and I came back home. And then the mines started back right after that.
So what year was this that you went to Richmond?
It was in 55, I think it was.
So just to explain a little bit, you couldn't get jobs where you were because the mines had shut down. So
I mean, you get a job, they weren't paying anything. They'd be working for somebody's kitchen or something. It'd be hard work, you know, and you weren't making any money. And at that time, just think, it sounds terrible now, but $75 a week, oh my goodness, that was a lot of money, you thought, at that time. If that's what you made down there. But like I said, I was only there about 6 months.
So how many kids did you left the family back?
And I went there to work and come back. Of course, I was able to come back to see them, you know, about every 2 or 3 weeks.
Now, what kind of work did you do in Richmond?
Babysit.
They paid $75 a week to babysit?
That was very good, you thought then, you know,
yeah,
in those
it's still
days.
good when I was a kid. I think that's it. If you'd like to add anything, is there anything that I haven't asked you or the stories you remember that you'd like to share?
Well, my children in education, I think you asked me that once before, but they've done, you know, quite well. My son retired from UPS in management. He was district manager. And then I have a daughter who works for the school board yet, And I have another daughter that's airline hostess, and she's been there for about 7 years. Prior to that, she lived in Denver, and she worked for Martin Marietta's secretary. And then I said I had a daughter who worked at the school board. Then I have one daughter that works at Metropolitan Housing in Columbus. And I have a daughter that works in Galplis, the same place that I retired from, a Galplis Developmental Center. And the children, the grandchildren have done well. I have one daughter that's in Cleveland. She's in television. She's can't think of that. Can't think. I've had a senior moment now. Anyway, she works in television. She's I forget her because I can't think of the title, but she's done real well. Then I have another. Well, I have a grandson that just recently got his bachelor's degree. He's working on his master's degree, and he works in the school system. I have another granddaughter that's a school teacher in Columbus. And then, like I said, I have a granddaughter that's just got Miss Arizona about 4 months ago. And anyway, they have done, you know, pretty good. They have good jobs, they have good education. And those that don't have are still working toward. So I'm very proud of them.
So just one quick last question before we end. What is your happiest or greatest memory then of your existence so far?
Well, my greatest memory is seeing the children, you know, do what they have done. I mean, I'm very proud of them and the grandchildren as to what they've accomplished. So that gives me great joy.
Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Henry.
Now, I don't know how that's going to come through. Okay. I don't know how it's going to